In this video, we're going to get to the start of Operation Barbarossa, and we're going to cover Phase 1, which lasted roughly from June to August of 1941. And it's this area you can see here in red, and it's simply a massive amount of territory. We're going to be talking about territory all the way from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea. So again, just a massive amount of territory. So again, we will cover Phase 1 in this video, and as I talked about in the last video, there are 3 areas of operation that we are going to be concerned with. And we will deal with the north, the center, and the south. And we will primarily focus on the center, but we will also talk about the operations going on in the north and the operations going on in the south. Now, in the weeks before Operation Barbarossa, Joseph Stalin had received disturbing reports that there were hundreds of overflights being recorded by the Soviet forces on the frontier. But Stalin chose to ignore these reports, believing that the Nazis were not about to invade the Soviet Union. Zhukov, however, the chief of the General Staff of the Soviet Army, disagreed, and he advised Joseph Stalin to put the Red Army in a state of readiness. But his advice was rejected by Stalin. Stalin was even warned by his master spy, but again chose to ignore these disturbing reports. And the main reason was that Stalin had an inherent distrust of the West, and he did not want to fight what he thought was England and France's war against Germany. And he also realized that he would be on his own if any war broke out between Germany and the Soviet Union. And as we know now, though, Stalin made a grave error in judgment as the Germans on June 22nd launched the largest invasion in human history. So we'll first cover the operations in the center. And it was in the center that Adolf Hitler concentrated most of his armor. Army Group Center had 2 massive panzer armies, the 3rd Panzer Army and the 2nd Panzer Army, commanded by one of their best tank commanders, Guderian. The other army groups, Army Group North and South, had just a single Panzer Army. Now, Army Group Center also had 2 infantry divisions, the 9th and the 4th. Now, the initial objectives of Army Group Center were Bialystok and Minsk. And so 3rd Panzer Group smashed through the Soviet defense lines and headed toward Minsk. In the south, the 2nd Panzer Group also headed toward Minsk, creating a vast encirclement of Soviet troops. And in just 5 days, they completed this encirclement. And so again, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were caught in a vice. When Stalin was informed that the German panzers had reached Minsk, he was in absolute disbelief that the German armored units could have reached Minsk in such a short duration, and this despite all of the counteroffensives that were launched against Army Group Center. Now, the numbers concerning this pocket around Minsk and Bialystok are simply staggering. The German army knocked out over 3,000 Soviet tanks, took 290,000 prisoners, with 341,000 killed. So these are simply staggering numbers for just a single battle. But this was actually typical in the opening days of Barbarossa. So during this first week of Barbarossa, Hitler was convinced that the Red Army had been destroyed. And he had good reason to believe this, given the staggering amount of Red Army losses during the first week of Barbarossa. Now, as you can see here marked in blue, there were 2 massive pockets that continued to fight on. And we'll talk about that in a few slides. Now, with the capture of Minsk, Army Group Center now had its sights on Smolensk. And you can see that right here on the map. And it was Smolensk that controlled the entire defense strategy for the Soviet capital, Moscow. And interestingly enough, Army Group Center was following the same exact route that Napoleon took over 100 years earlier when he invaded Russia. Napoleon also needed to capture Smolensk. Now, we will talk about Smolensk in a few slides. Now let's shift to the south. Now, Army Group South was commanded by Rundstedt, and under his command was the 1st Panzer Army Group, which you can see right here, and the 6th and 17th Armies. It was the 6th Army that had triumphantly marched through Paris 1 year earlier. Now, the initial objective for Army Group South was the capital of the Ukraine, Kiev, which you can see right here on the map. And so the 1st and 6th Armies would push towards Kiev, while the 17th Army would push towards Uman, which you can see right here on the map. Now, facing the Germans were 9 Soviet armies. Despite this, the 6th and the 1st Army succeeded in pushing to just a few miles outside of Kiev, and they were also able to fend off a major counterattack, but that was pushed aside, and the German armies pushed on in the south. But they failed to take Kiev, and there were 3 primary reasons. First was Joseph Stalin believed that if there was an attack, the Germans would concentrate their forces in the south. And so weeks before Barbarossa, he transferred several divisions from the center to the south. So that was the first issue. The second problem involved an area known as the Pripyat Marshes. And this was a very swampy area and was practically impenetrable. And so this was a natural defense area north of Kiev. And the third problem was that the Soviets had one of their best field commanders in Kirpinos, and he commanded the southern front. And so you can see here during phase 1, this huge bulge began to develop. And there were nearly 700,000 Soviet troops in this gigantic bulge. And we will talk about that in a few slides. Now let's shift towards the north. Now, Army Group North was commanded by Field Marshal von Lieb, and he was in charge of the 4th Panzer Army and the 18th and 16th Infantry Armies. Now, there were 2 initial objectives of Army Group North. The first was to capture ports along the Baltic Sea, and the second was the speedy capture of Leningrad. And so Army Group North, of course, was tasked with taking Leningrad. Now, facing Army Group North were 2 Soviet armies, and in the first few weeks, Army Group North eliminated 90% of the Soviet tanks, and mainly this was because the Air Force of the Red Army had been pretty much annihilated, and so the Luftwaffe was able to concentrate on Soviet armor. Now, by August, Army Group North had captured Tallinn, which you can see right up here on the map. And this was a major port for Red Army naval forces. And despite a hasty retreat, the Soviets lost hundreds of ships and countless soldiers. After Tallinn was captured, 18th Army, along with the 4th Panzer Army, pushed towards Leningrad. And by the end of August, they were on the outskirts of Leningrad. And this would set up one of the most famous sieges in history, the Siege of Leningrad, which would last nearly 900 days. Can you imagine that? Being cut off from your country for 900 days. And we will talk about that in a future video. Now let's switch back to the action in the center. Now, as I mentioned before, Army Group Center captured Minsk in late June. By early July, Army Group Center was prepared to launch an attack against Smolensk, which was the key to the Soviet defense strategy in the center. And once again, it was the 3rd Panzer Army that launched its attack from the north, and the 2nd Panzer Army which launched its attack from the south. And on July 27th, the 2 tank armies linked up past Smolensk, completing yet another massive encirclement of Soviet forces. And Army Group Center achieved this despite several Soviet counterattacks. Now, the biggest problem facing Army Group Center in the early days of Barbarossa were pockets. And you can see the 3 main pockets that we've talked about right here. And these involved hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers that fought on and on and on, despite being surrounded and cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. And German army commanders, and even Hitler himself, were shocked that these troops would fight on, despite having almost no hope. And this would hamper operations further east, because these pockets had to be eliminated before Army Group Center could launch any attack on Moscow. And it wasn't until August until these pockets were eliminated. And the numbers for the pocket around Minsk and Smolensk are simply staggering. There were nearly 600,000 prisoners taken, almost 750,000 Soviet soldiers killed, and nearly 7,000 tanks destroyed. To give you an idea, the Soviets suffered more losses in these 2 engagements than Britain and the U.S. did combined for all of World War II. So that ought to give you an idea of the numbers involved here. Now, as I said, it wasn't until August that these 3 pockets were eliminated, and this would lead to the next step. And this was one of the most controversial decisions in World War II. Should Army Group Center push towards Moscow, or should the pocket around Kiev, that massive bulge that we talked about earlier, should that be eliminated? And so that was the decision facing Hitler and his senior commanders, and we will get to that in the next video.